February 3rd, 1945, Eiffel Hills, Western Germany. A lonely road cuts through deep snow, past burned farms and dead trees. American trucks growl in low gear, chains scraping on ice, headlights glowing weakly in a rising white wall of storm. Below one shattered building, 12 German women prisoners huddle in a dark cellar, sure the Americans will drive away and let the blizzard finish what the war began. All their training says the same thing. If the enemy captures you, expect hunger, shame, and no mercy, especially if you are a woman in a German uniform. But as the storm closes in, the women feel hands grab them, not to hit or push, but to lift them onto American shoulders, to be carried mile after mile through the killing cold. Why would men who had lost friends to German guns risk their own lives to save the very people they were ordered to fight? This is not a movie script. It happened on one forgotten night, on one frozen road, and it changed what enemy meant forever for those who were there. If you want to know how that choice in the blizzard rewrote their lives, watch to the end. And please like, subscribe, and support the channel so we can keep uncovering hidden World War II stories like this. The winter of 1944-45 was the coldest many soldiers had ever known. In the hills of the Eiffel, on Germany's western border, snow lay in heavy drifts along broken roads. Wind slid like a knife through torn coats. Even without bullets, men and women froze in their sleep. The big German attack in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge, had failed. In December and January, more than 19,000 American soldiers had died pushing the Germans back. Now, in early February, US units were moving again, step by step, toward the Rhine. For every mile gained, engineers laid down about 500 yards of wire and cleared tons of rubble, turning ruined villages into supply lines. Behind the collapsing German front, confusion ruled. Trains no longer ran on time, orders arrived late or not at all. Among the stragglers on the roads were women from the Wehrmacht's support units, signals, helpers, clerks, nurses. Many were barely in their 20s. Some had joined the German Women's Auxiliary, the Helferinnen, thinking they would answer phones and type letters in safe cities. Instead, the war had chased them to the front. One group, 12 women in all, marched through the slush outside a small town the Americans called Hildorf. They carried canvas packs and one small medical bag between them. Their boots were thin, their grey uniforms were soaked at the hems. Snow stuck to their wool skirts and to the loose hair that hung from under their field caps. They had been told many things about the enemy. In classes and in loud radio speeches, Nazi instructors said that if Americans ever captured German women, they would shame them, starve them, maybe worse. Surrender, they were warned, was not only cowardly, it was a kind of death of the soul. Yet the war around them did not match those stories. They saw German officers driving past in trucks while they walked. They heard that in the last month, more than 100,000 German soldiers had been taken prisoner in the West alone. Some had been marched to the rear without being shot, which was not what propaganda had promised. One of the women, Anna, kept a small notebook in her coat. Years later, her son would read her words aloud to a historian. "We were more afraid of the cold than of the enemy by then," she had written. The snow did not care if you were German or American. It took the weak all the same. The cold was everywhere. Breath came out in white clouds. The inside of the women's gloves stayed damp. When they found a half-burned shed, they broke off blackened boards and tried to start a fire. The wood hissed and spat. Smoke stung their eyes and clung to their hair. For a few minutes, they felt heat on their faces. Then the wind took that too. The paradox was simple and cruel. They wore the uniform of a regime that spoke of greatness and victory, yet they were hungry, freezing, and alone. The Third Reich still filled the airwaves with talk of secret weapons and final triumph. On the ground, 12 women shuffled along a ruined lane, trading a crust of bread that had to last for 2 days. Overhead, American planes moved east. In January 1945, Allied bombers had dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs on Germany in a single month. The women heard the distant thunder but could not see the bombers through the low clouds. They only saw the results: smashed bridges, smoking rail yards, and villages with more walls missing than standing. At night, the sounds changed. No more engines in the sky, only the distant thump of artillery and the closer creak of frozen trees. Sometimes there was a sharp crack as a branch, heavy with ice, snapped and fell. In the dark, it sounded like rifle fire, and the women flinched. One night, crammed into the cellar of a half-ruined schoolhouse, they listened to the wind outside and to each other's breathing. The air smelled of damp plaster, burned wood, and unwashed bodies. They had one small stove and only a little coal. They argued quietly about whether to keep the fire going or save fuel for the next day. In the end, they let it burn low. Sleep, when it came, was thin and full of bad dreams. "We were told we must never fall into enemy hands," Anna wrote. "But there, in that cellar, I began to think perhaps the enemy could not be worse than this." Beyond the town, American patrols were closing in, moving from farm to farm, house to house, counting prisoners and checking cellars for hidden weapons. They had weather reports in their pockets, temperatures dropping, snow coming, a blizzard likely within 24 hours. The roads would soon be deadly. The paths of the shivering German women and the tired American soldiers were about to cross, just as the worst storm of the month rolled over the Eiffel hills. At first light, the Americans came into Hildorf. Their boots rang on broken cobblestones. Tanks and trucks growled between half-ruined houses. The air smelled of diesel, smoke, and wet stone. A rifle platoon from an infantry regiment moved ahead of the vehicles, checking doors and cellars. In this sector, US First Army had taken more than 10,000 prisoners in the last 2 weeks. Most surrendered without a fight. A few still hid and shot from windows. Sergeant Tom Miller led one squad toward the old schoolhouse. Glass crunched under his boots. A blackboard leaned against a cracked wall, chalk dust mixed with plaster. Somewhere below he heard a faint cough. He signaled for quiet. The men stopped. Only the ticking of a distant engine and the soft hiss of falling snow broke the silence. Miller eased the cellar door open. A wave of cold, damp air hit his face, carrying the smell of coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Flashlights cut through the dark. 12 pale faces turned toward the light. Women, thin and grey with exhaustion, blinked and tried to stand. Some raised their hands at once. One clutched a Red Cross armband to her chest like a shield. For a second, both sides simply stared. The Americans had expected maybe a sniper or a rear guard. The women had expected men with hard faces and hard hands. Instead, there was a moment of shared surprise. One of the women tried to speak. "Bitte, wir sind Sanitäterinnen," she said. "Medics?" Her voice cracked. Another, Anna, later wrote, "I thought this is the end. Now they will do all the things we were warned about." Miller did not understand German, but he saw no weapons, only fear and thin coats. "They're auxiliaries," said Corporal Diaz, the medic, pointing to the armband. "They're half frozen." His breath steamed in the beam of his own flashlight. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing snow through broken windows in fine white curtains. In the command post 2 streets away, the company radio crackled with new orders. A staff officer's voice came through, flat and urgent. Pull back to the ridgeline by nightfall. A blizzard was coming. No delays, no stray patrols. The weather report from Division said it clearly. Temperatures would drop below 15 degrees C. Wind gusts could reach 60 kilometers per hour. In such conditions, exposed skin froze in minutes. Trucks stalled. Guns iced over. In January alone, more than 500 American soldiers in Europe had been recorded as cold weather casualties. Now Miller's men were told to move fast. The road east would soon be blocked by snow and wrecks. Their trucks already sat full of men and supplies. There was no spare space, at least on paper. Down in the cellar, the women watched as the Americans spoke into their radios. They caught only a few words. Prisoners, 12, female, storm. But the tone was clear. Time was short. One private muttered, "We can march them to the crossroads and leave them with the next outfit." Another said nothing, but stared at the women's feet. 3 of them had boots so worn that bare toes peeked through holes, purple from cold. Anna wrote, "I waited for them to decide which of us could walk and which would be left. We were enemy soldiers after all, even if we did not feel like soldiers." Here was the sharp contrast on the map. These 12 women were just numbers, POWs to be moved from one report column to another. In the cellar, they shivered, coughed, and wiped smoke from their eyes. The war machine saw statistics. The men saw human being. Lieutenant Harris, the platoon leader, came down the stairs, ducking under a broken beam. Snowflakes swirled in behind him. He felt the cold like a hand on the back of his neck. "We've got to clear this town and fall back," he told Miller. "Trucks are packed. Roads are turning to ice." Miller looked from his officer to the women. "Sir, some of them can't walk a mile, let alone 5, he said quietly. Diaz nodded. "They won't last an hour out there," the medic added. Later, Harris would tell an interviewer. The book answer was simple. Move on, let the rearguard deal with them, but when you see their faces, it stops being simple. They brought the women out of the cellar one by one. The grey sky pressed low over the village, snow pricked at cheeks and lashes, engines idled, sending up clouds of exhaust that smelled oily and bitter but promised movement and warmth. A few women could walk, limping, using each other's arms for balance. Others could barely stand. One collapsed as soon as she reached the street, her legs folding under her. Diaz checked her pulse with gloved fingers, feeling the slow, weak beat. Above them, white clouds gathered, thicker by the minute. The first true gusts of the coming storm shoved at men and women alike, making them stagger. Somewhere behind the lines, officers counted miles and hours. Here, at the edge of Hildorf, a small group of soldiers had to decide what those numbers meant for the lives in front of them. The storm was almost on them, and with it came a choice between following orders and following conscience. Snow thickened over Hildorf as men and women waited at the edge of the village. Engines idled, metal ticking as it cooled. The air was sharp with exhaust, cold iron, and the faint smell of burned wood drifting from ruined houses. Lieutenant Harris stood by the lead truck, radio handset pressed to his ear. A voice from battalion repeated the same message. Pull back to the ridge before dark, no delays. The line had to move. Artillery and fuel were already calculated for the next position. Mile by mile, each 2 1-2-ton truck was packed. Regulations said a truck could carry about 25 fully equipped soldiers. Today, most carried closer to 30, plus crates of ammunition and fuel can. There was no line in the manual for add a dozen half-frozen enemy women. Sergeant Miller and the medic Diaz walked slowly down the row of prisoners. Snow squeaked under their boots. They checked hands and faces for white, numb patches of frostbite. Out of 12 German women, they judged 4 completely unable to walk far. 3 more could stand only with help. Diaz pulled off one glove and touched a bare foot where the boot sole had split. The skin felt like cold wax. "She won't make a kilometre," he said quietly. "Not in this." A private nearby shifted his rifle. "We can't carry them all," he muttered. "We can't even fit them in the trucks. Orders say move, Sarge." That was the heart of the problem. On paper, war was neat. Arrows on maps, blocks of numbers, plans written in clean ink. In reality, it looked like this. Shivering women with blue lips and tired men trying to match orders to conscience, while icy wind tried to push everyone off the road. Later, Harris would tell an army historian, the legal answer was simple. Leave them in a house, report their location, let the rear units pick them up if they could. But when I looked at them, I knew rear units wouldn't get through that storm in time. Anna noticed the men's faces as they spoke. They argued among themselves, she wrote. One pointed to our feet and shook his head. Another looked at the sky. I did not understand the words, but I understood that our lives were being weighed. The paradox cut deep. These women had worn the uniform of a state that boasted of hardness and sacrifice. Now in the snow, it was the enemy who had to decide how much their lives were worth. Harris called his sergeants close. Snowflakes clung to his eyebrows. His breath came in short, white bursts. "Battalion wants us on that ridge before night," he said. "Trucks can take the walking ones. That's maybe 5. That leaves 7 who can't handle the march." Miller stared back. "Sir, if we leave them and that storm hits like they say, they're done," he answered. "We've already taken more than 200 prisoners this week. I'm not about to start choosing who freezes." For a moment, no one spoke. Wind hissed through the bare branches over the road. From inside, one truck. A radio played a faint swing tune, thin and strange in the winter air. "We could stay with them," Diaz suggested. "Small group. March on foot. Carry the worst off the road if we have to. Catch up tomorrow." Harris did the quick math in his head. Holding back a squad meant fewer rifles at the next line. It meant men he knew by name, Miller, Diaz, Jenkins, O'Reilly, would be out in the open when the storm came. It was risk, plain and simple. But there was another kind of risk, one no report would show. If they walked away now, they would remember these faces for the rest of their lives. "I didn't want to explain to my grandchildren someday that I left girls in a ditch because the weather was bad," he said years later. "War's ugly, but it doesn't excuse everything." Finally, he spoke. "We're not abandoning them," he said. "Trucks take the ones who can walk, plus a couple of the lighter cases. Miller, you take a squad and the rest of the prisoners. You'll march behind the column. If they can't walk, you carry them." A private blurted, "Sir, that's 6, 7 miles in this. Will be ice by dark." Harris met his eyes. "Then you move faster," he said, though he knew they could not. Softer, he added, "No one gets left to die in a ditch. Not on my watch. That's an order." Anna remembered one American stepping closer and miming lifting something on his back. "He pointed to me, then to his own shoulders," she wrote. "Only then did I understand. They would not leave us, even the weakest ones." The decision rippled down the line. Men loosened their packs, shifted gear, glanced at the women they would soon be carrying. The trucks began to roll, chains clanking on the ice, taillights glowing red through the first thick curtains of snow. At the rear, Miller's small group and the 7 weakest prisoners stepped off the road and into the white fields, where there was no shelter between Hilldorf and the distant ridge, only wind, drifting snow, and a long, hard walk. Then the storm closed in, and talk gave way to action. The storm came fast. One moment, Miller's small group could still see the red glow of truck lights ahead. The next, the world turned white. Snow blew sideways, thick as smoke. The road, the ditches, the fields, Everything vanished under a moving curtain of ice. They tied a rope around each person's waist. American, German, American, German. Miller went in front, Diaz in the middle, another sergeant at the rear. The wind pushed at their chests and grabbed at the rope, trying to tear the line apart. The air hurt to breathe. At 15 degrees C with wind gusts of 60 kilometers per hour, the cold sliced through coats and into bone. The soldiers knew the numbers. That winter, more than 11,000 American troops in Europe would suffer frostbite or trench foot. Cold was an enemy as real as any German gunner. 2 of the German women could not stand at all. Miller crouched and let one climb onto his back. She was light, maybe 45 kilos, but in the deep snow she felt twice that. Private Jenkins, only 19, took another woman the same way. Her arms rested weakly around his neck, fingers stiff in thin gloves. Anna walked with help from Diaz and another soldier. "We were like children, between tall fathers," she later wrote. "The rope pulled at my waist and I could not see my own feet when I looked down." The snow swallowed sound. Voices came out flat and dull. Only the wind had a clear voice, a long rising howl through bare trees and broken fence posts. Sometimes the rope jerked as someone stumbled in a drift. Boots sank to the knee, then to the thigh. Every step was a fight. They could no longer see the trucks or the village behind them. The world had shrunk to the person in front, the pull of the rope, and the white space of the next step. Jenkins slipped first. His foot found a hidden ditch, and he went down hard on one knee, his prisoner crashing into the snow beside him. For a few seconds, both lay still. Diaz felt the rope go slack and shouted, his words torn away by the wind. Miller stopped, and the whole line bunched up. "I can't feel my hands," Jenkins gasped when they dragged him up. His lips were pale, his breath shallow. Diaz grabbed his chin, looked into his eyes. "You're feeling them enough to complain?" the medic answered. "That means you keep moving." Anna felt guilt heavy in her chest. "I wanted to tell the young man to leave me," she wrote. "I was the enemy. Why should he freeze for me? But I had no words in English, only my eyes." The paradox was sharp. These men had been trained for years to kill Germans. Some had lost friends in the Hürtgen forest, only a few dozen kilometers away, where 33,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Now the same men bent forward and used their last strength to carry German women through a storm that might kill them all. They tried to set a rhythm, 50 steps, then a short pause, then 50 more. Diaz checked fingers and cheeks whenever they stopped, searching for grey, numb skin. "Pain is good," he told them. "If it hurts, it's still alive." One of the women began to drift, her steps slowing, her head drooping. She mumbled in German, words no one understood. Then her legs simply folded, and she hung from the rope like a sack. A private behind her swore. "We can't carry another one, Sarge," he shouted. "We're at the limit." Miller looked back through the swirling snow. He saw a young face, lips blue, eyes half closed. He thought of his own sister back in Ohio, just a year younger. "We're not leaving her," he said. "We rotate 10 minutes each. Drop your packs if you have to." Reluctantly, 2 men shrugged off their rucksacks. Food, spare socks, extra ammunition fell into the snow. The unconscious woman was lifted, awkwardly at first, then more securely over a shoulder. Every 10 minutes, another man took her, teeth clenched, breath ragged. Anna remembered that moment. "They let their own things fall," she wrote. "For us, I did not understand such generosity from those we had been told were animals. Time lost meaning. It might have been 2 hours or 4. The rope, the wind, the weight on their backs, the burn in their legs, these were the only measures left. Some men began to see shapes in the snow that were not there, dark doorways, lines of trees, lights that vanished when they drew closer. At last, Diaz, half blind with ice on his lashes, saw a faint orange glow ahead. Not a trick this time. Real light, steady and low. "There!" he shouted. "Light!" They pushed toward it, the line bending, the rope straining. A small stone farmhouse came into view, windows stuffed with blankets, a big canvas tent beside it marked with a red cross. The field dressing station at the rear of the new line. Voices rose from the shadows. Men ran out, grabbed at the rope, took the weight of numb bodies from American shoulders. Warm air, smelling of iodine, sweat, and coffee, poured out as the farmhouse door opened. Miller staggered inside with the woman still on his back, and felt heat hit his frozen face like a slap. Somewhere behind him, Anna crossed the threshold and stared at clean sheets and metal beds, more shocked by this sight than by any shell burst she had known. But what awaited them in that cramped, busy aid station would challenge their beliefs even more than the storm had. Inside the farmhouse, heat wrapped around them like a blanket. A big iron stove glowed in the corner. Wet wool steamed. The room smelled of coffee, iodine, sweat, and boiled cabbage. Compared to the white storm outside, it felt like another world. American medics moved fast. They had done this many times. A small field dressing station like this with only 20 beds could treat 80 to 100 men in a hard day, then send most to larger hospitals in the rear. Now, along with their own wounded, they had 7 half-frozen German women to save. "Get those boots off gently," a captain ordered. Thermometers slid under tongues and into armpits. Normal body temperature is 37 degrees 6. 2 of the women were at 34 degrees, 1 at 32 degrees. Any lower, and the heart could stop without warning. They cut away stiff stockings and held grey swollen feet in gloved hands. Some toes were white and hard, with no feeling at all. "Frostbite 2nd, maybe 3rd degree," one medic muttered. He had seen it on American feet in the Ardennes only weeks before. The women waited for rough treatment. Instead, they got blankets, warm drinks, and quiet, firm voices. "Sip, not gulp," a nurse told Anna in slow English, guiding a mug of thin soup to her lips. "Too fast will make you sick." The soup tasted of salt, fat, and carrots. To Anna, it tasted like life. Later, she wrote, "They gave us the same blankets as their own boys, the same soup. I watched the nurse cover a wounded American, then cover me with another blanket from the same pile. The sameness broke something in my heart. The paradox was painful and clear. For years, German radio had shouted that Americans were brutal and greedy, that they would starve and shame German prisoners. Yet here, American hands checked pulses, shared coffee, and spoke softly, while outside the storm howled without mercy. In one corner, metal shelves held stacks of rations. A standard US field ration then provided about 3,500 calories a day, canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, sugar. German soldiers at the end of the war often lived on less than 1,500 calories. Thin soup, black bread, sometimes only potatoes. One nurse, no more than 20, stared at the shelves with wide eyes. "So much food just waiting," she whispered in German. "We fought such a rich enemy." The Americans were just as shaken, in a different way. After the crisis eased, Miller sat on a crate near the stove, boots off, socks steaming. Jenkins rubbed his numb hands, still feeling the ghost weight of the woman he had carried. "Think they'd have done the same for us?" one private asked. His voice was tired, not bitter, more like a real question than a complaint. Diaz shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not," he said. "Doesn't matter. We did what we did so we can sleep at night, not because of what they would do." Miller listened, staring at the floorboards. Years later, he told an interviewer, "I hated what the German army had done. I'd seen our own boys come back in pieces, but carrying those women, I stopped seeing Germany and started seeing faces. That's the hardest part of war, remembering there is a person inside the uniform." In her diary, Anna tried to capture her own confusion. "I had believed the posters, the films, the speeches. Enemies were monsters, but the man who carried me up the last hill was shaking from cold and effort. When he set me down, he smiled just a little. It was not the smile, it was the tired smile of a man who has done something hard and is glad it is over." The women stayed at the station for several days. Their feet were wrapped in soft dressing. Fingers that might have turned black were saved. Some toes were lost. All kept their lives. At night, they lay in clean sheets and listened to American soldiers snore, cough, and dream in the next room. The thin wall between them seemed strange, given how close death had come on the road. Word of the march spread only a little. The war was still raging. In those weeks, US forces in Europe took tens of thousands more German prisoners. On reports, the 7 women from Hildorf became simple numbers in the POW female column. But in the private pages of a German diary, in the quiet memories of a few American soldiers, the stormy night stayed sharp. It would take many years before anyone else heard about it and understood how far its echoes. After the war ended in May 1945, the people from that night went separate ways. The American soldiers rode trucks and ships back across the ocean. The German women passed through crowded collection points, long lines, shouted names, the clank of canteens, before being sent to larger POW camps. In all, more than 7 million German soldiers surrendered to the Western Allies in 1945. Among them were several thousand women from signal units, anti-aircraft crews, and medical services. On the big charts at headquarters, they were just part of those millions. Small lines in thick reports. Anna spent almost a year in a British-run camp. She slept in a wooden barrack that smelled of damp boards, coal smoke, and cheap soap. She received about 2,000 calories a day, bread, margarine, watery stew, sometimes jam. It was more food than she had seen in months before capture, but far less than the American 3,500-calorie rations she had watched being handed out like routine supplies. "We had lost everything," she later wrote. "Our cities, our pride, our belief in victory. But in the camp I also lost my belief that the enemy was a monster. That loss hurt, but it was a good pain." Most women did not talk about their time as prisoners when they went home. In ruined German towns, people wanted to hear stories of resistance, not surrender. Former POWs often hid their status. Anna married, raised children in a small flat that always smelled of boiled potatoes and laundry, and put her thin diary on a high shelf. In America, Miller, Diaz, and the others also tried to live normal lives. They joined the millions of veterans who returned. Between 1945 and 1946, more than 8 million US service members in all. They worked in factories, studied on the GI Bill, taught school, fixed cars. When they spoke of the war, they talked about big battles, not a single night in a blizzard, with 7 German women. Only in old age did some of them sit down with tape recorders and patient interviewers. A retired teacher named Miller, hands spotted with age, described the march. "We were supposed to be the conquerors," he said, his voice rough on the old tape. "But out there in the snow carrying those girls, I felt more like a student. I was learning what kind of man I wanted to be." That line captured the main paradox. They had come as conquerors. They left as students. Decades later, a young German scholar looking into women's roles in the Wehrmacht came across Anna's diary in a family box. The paper smelled of dust and old ink. The tight handwriting told of propaganda lessons, of hunger, of fear, and finally, of American arms lifting her out of the snow. Across the ocean, an American grad student listened to Miller's taped words in a quiet archive room, the machine whirring softly. She checked his unit's records and found a brief note in a February 1945 report. Escorted 7 female POWs to rear aid station in extreme weather, all delivered, alive. Just one line among many pages of figures. Taken together, numbers, diary, tape, these pieces formed a clear picture. A small act, almost lost in a huge war, had crossed borders and generations. Anna's children grew up hearing that Americans had saved their mother's feet and her life. Miller's grandchildren learned that their grandfather had once dropped his pack in the snow so he could carry an enemy. Because they carried us, I could later carry my own children. Anna wrote to a historian shortly before she died. This is how mercy moves through time. One night in the snow becomes many lives afterward. Nations rebuilt. Enemies became trade partners and allies. West Germany, and later a united Germany, stood beside the United States in new alliances. The big reasons for that are found in politics, money, and strategy. But there is also a quieter reason written between the lines. Thousands of small encounters where people chose to act humanely, even when they did not have to. In the end, the lesson from that stormy march is simple but hard. Real strength is not only in guns, tanks, or plans. It is in the moment when a tired soldier decides to carry someone he has been told is not worth saving. In the long view of history, the blizzard near Hildorf was just one night, involving a few soldiers and 7 women. Yet it showed a truth that big speeches and posters often hide. Propaganda said enemies were less than human. Reality said they shivered, stumbled, and hoped just like anyone else. Those Americans could have followed the easy path and left their prisoners to the storm. Instead, they chose the harder road, one step at a time through ice and wind, until warmth and light waited ahead. Because of that choice, lives continued, families were built, and stories were told on both sides of the ocean. In the end, a nation's greatest power is not only in its weapons, but in its will to remember that even an enemy is still a person.